Hello and welcome to the second session of Momentum. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully, you're following this on from session one around acceleration and coherence. And look, thank you for your time. I'm glad you're spending it focused on this material. So let's get straight into it. This session is around the sort of second core component of Momentum, which is called translation. So in this series of guided videos, we've gone through it. The first step, or the first video, was around sort of setting the scene, why we chose to do this, what's in it for you, what it's in a response to, some of the kind of core cultural and operating pillars of Momentum. Last session, which was a long one, was around acceleration and coherence. That was around cracking a problem in a fast and logical, robust way. So we went through a whole bunch of different processes and techniques to do that. The translation part is really about converting that answer into action. And that's obviously super critical. But it is a step that sometimes can be missed or can be incomplete. So you get a great answer that is, let's say, hastily executed or hastily kind of transitioned over, and a lot of that great thinking and a lot of the intent and the nuance behind the answer can get lost. So the translation phase is all about making sure that all the inputs and the thinking and the drivers and the intent of acceleration and coherence can make it through to that next phase, that translation phase, and the people involved, of which there probably will be quite a lot, are all really clear on how you kind of got to the answer and what your expectations are of them and what really successful delivery looks like. If you can do that, I think you've got a pretty successful translation phase for one. More importantly, you've got a really good chance of the answer yielding a positive result. So to recap really quickly, Momentum's a planning framework developed to help marketers, media and advertising leaders make better decisions and deliver improved commercial outcomes. And just to recap, it's really focused on solving problems. I think problem solving is really at the heart of marketing, media and advertising, and what makes it a really interesting, fulfilling place if you can get into solving problems and get close to those problems. The second part is around making better decisions. We're faced with decisions every single day, every single hour. There's no shortage of decisions, all the way through from getting a brief right through to delivery, how you choose to express that delivery, how you choose to report on it, how you choose to reflect on it. So decision making is super critical. And if we can make better decisions, which I think is a muscle, it's something that's never quite finished. You're just sort of building that strength. It'll basically, create a really significant upside for everybody. The last part is the commercial focus. I think when we are doing marketing activities, they are ultimately aimed at a commercial endpoint. That's, I think, great having that quantified target and that quantified goal. But I think we've got to sort of be pragmatic that what we do is inherently rooted in helping people sell things. And I think success more often than not results in that. It's very difficult to have a great campaign that didn't help sell more things or deliver that result. So I think we've got to be pretty pragmatic about that for one. And I think also be really excited about that. There's a lot of positive things that can come. There's a lot of credibility that comes from having a positive contribution to the success of a business in a commercial sense. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about translation and why it's important. We're going to talk about action mapping and really understanding consumer touch points between seeing an advertisement and sort of doing the thing we want them to do. This is really about understanding how someone sort of thinks, feels, and does after, and all the different things that they can do as a result. I think if you've got, like we touched on in that first acceleration and coherence session, if you've got a really strong understanding and empathy, at least outside in for the customer, I think you can develop communications, you can develop activities that can play a reasonable role in sort of persuading them to do something. So action mapping is a more pointy version of that. after you've solved the problem. So you've got like a whole bunch of consumer empathy things while you're trying to solve the problem, while you're immersing yourself in the problem. Once you've developed the answer, I think action mapping really is about being a bit more purposeful around what those areas are that you can use in the answer. And we'll talk through that. There's briefing, commonly done. Everyone has a view on briefing, including me. I'll touch on the way I think briefing really works. And I think if we think about the process to date, with situation, complication, question, answer, rationale for an answer, and supporting data, you can use that process pretty well for briefing as well. And I think that allows you to save time for one. And I think it also means that everybody's getting a similar sense of, again, how you arrived at the answer and what those expectations are. So the expectations have got to be really clearly laid out. Steering and guidance was a big part of acceleration and coherence. Steering and guidance between the advisor, say the agency person, which is probably you watching this, and the client. Steering and guidance in this sense is there's probably a whole bunch of peers as well as partners that you want to get involved. They also need a similar process in order to allow them to do their best work. And I think investing that time in steercos and guiding them towards, their best chance at a successful answer is time really well spent. Quantifying decisions, again, we touched on the importance of decision making. There's going to be a lot of instances where you can't do every single thing. Pretty much every single instance is like that. So in that sense, what you want to make sure you can do is make structured, defendable or defensible decisions that have some level of kind of quantification behind them in order to help explain how choices have been made, both to the people who the choices were made for and maybe not for, as well as for a client who's going to really kind of want a handle of how you arrived at a certain place. And then planning to fail in order to succeed, which seems counterintuitive, but what it does is it creates a completely different perspective of looking at what needs to be done in order to succeed. So I really like this idea of this, what we call a pre-mortem, which effectively looks at what could go wrong, what does failure look like, and then what you can do is effectively start to understand the likelihood of that from happening, and then find ways to say, okay, we're not there now, we haven't actually commenced. What will we need to do to probably eliminate that failure point? And I think that's a really good sort of governance, due diligence thing to do that, again, can unlock some really strong translation activities and initiatives that give it the best chance of the answer delivering like you thought it was going to deliver. In I guess its simplest sense, translation is about carrying the answer from a position of endorsement, so the client has endorsed it, to a place of action. Answers are defined. Our work is ultimately defined by action and results. So it's great that in this sort of theoretical framework with B2B Co, we have cracked the answer in a week. But again, that's an on-paper answer in a completely controlled environment. This is where we sort of take the answer out into the real world and we start to see exactly what we need to do to have it deliver in the way that we want it to deliver. And so you've obviously factored that in terms of coming up with an answer that can be delivered. But again, the competition moves really quickly, brands move really quickly, consumers move really quickly. The circumstances in which you built the answer may not be the circumstances in which you need to deliver the answer. And then when it actually is occurring, they may be different circumstances altogether. So you can see that nothing is stable in that sense, or we can't plan for it to be stable. I think you've got to plan for it to be changing and then have systems in place that allow you to adapt when it does change or if it does change. So what do we mean by providing the answer with the best chance of success? So the focus is really communicating the answer to the people and teams that will be involved in enabling and delivering on it. I think it sounds really simple and it sounds really reductive, but if you can get this done, just primarily this part, it's probably the most powerful generator of strong delivery. Because a lot of the time, weak delivery doesn't come from a place of incompetence or anything like that. It just comes from unclear direction. And it's really difficult to deliver a great outcome if the direction is really unclear. The core is landing on an answer and making a robust case for it in acceleration and coherence. And often the way that an answer is communicated to a client executive in order to be endorsed is really different to how it's got to be communicated to the team involved. So you can't really, what you see a lot of the time happen is someone will say, oh, I did this strategy. The client really loved it. Here you go. There you go. That explains it all. So can you go away and kind of make it all happen? And if you think about what you're after when you present a strategy or an answer to a client, is you're ultimately seeking endorsement, and you're seeking them to understand it enough to make that endorsement. In this sense, for a execution type peer audience, they're not there to endorse it. They've got a lot of specific questions because they ultimately have to sort of make. So if you've sort of planned this, I need to make this cake, and it's going to be great and have icing on top and have blah and this and this, they're going to say, well, what are the specific ingredients? What do you expect of me? Or when does it need to be done? How hot should X, Y, Z be? How hot should the oven be? Those sorts of elements. So then you start need to be getting into, well, I thought it would need to have these ingredients and have this sort of preparation, have this sort of technique and those sorts of things. If you don't have an idea of how to do that, the answer is not really that credible, is it? In terms of a process map, what you see here is we start here in what we call this master translation brief. And then what happens is these briefs will sort of flare out as much as what's needed. So the example we've got in this instance is media, creative, and what we're calling web, which is sort of a catch-all for digital, and the point of sale, which is the website for B2B Co. Then you've got these processes that go along here. Then it kind of flares back into the pre-mortem. So you're making your functional brief, you're giving guidance, you're getting responses, you're making selection, and then those things come in, and you've got your pre-mortem and you've got your management systems that are coming in there. So what we'll do is kind of break out this functional brief part into the three. And then what we'll do is focus on what a good steerco, a good sort of response process, and good selection process looks like with just one example. Then we'll go into this pre-mortem management system and explain that. So that's what the session looks like. Firstly, like I touched on, was action mapping. I was really unclear of where to put this. I think initially I thought it was part of acceleration and coherence. It was something that you could sort of sit there and say, this helps me get, under the skin of the customer. But I think it becomes much more effective when it's used after you've come up with the answer. So it's not to say that, like we touched on, sort of things like drivers and different actions and getting in the head of the customer isn't important. It absolutely is, and we spent a lot of time on that. But having that kind of process map, I think, is better used in this process, and I'll show you. What it is basically a process flow diagram. If you're not familiar with it, they're very simple. I'll show you an example, but basically it's got a whole bunch of sort of what we call swim lanes that represent different things. And what we're trying to see is from sort of in the kind of most linear sense, the process from going from one spot to another spot. That's not to say that people can't go back and forward and skip spots. They absolutely can. But like we said earlier in the first session, is we're trying to develop views of the customer that are as broad in their application as we possibly can. We can't actually look at every single implication of how every single customer behaves. It's not realistic. Like I said, it's not a perfect illustration. It's outside in. It's done from sort of observation and research. It's meant to be directional and to understand internal, external elements and context that can really get in the way or enable someone to buying it. So if you're the person who's responsible for building something like this, one of the sort of pieces of advice I can give you is look out for someone who's trying to find every fault. Oh, you missed a spot there, and do we really know this, or do we really know that? I think that sort of questioning is fine if they have builds, but if it's just sort of someone to either slow the process up or to be heard, again, it can turn into a process where someone tries to undermine the confidence of an action map and then leaves you with nothing. And I'd much prefer a relatively accurate directional action map than a blank page. And I think there's a much more value that can come out of a relatively accurate one or a highly accurate one than somebody saying, "Oh, I think you missed a spot here," and I'll give you sort of a visual of that. They'll generally follow a similar format with swim lanes and interactive kind of lines, but the elements will change. I think that say if you look at B2B Co, the way that you purchase that product is very different to how you might purchase a personal computer, or how you might purchase a home loan, or how you might purchase fast food. So there's a bunch of different things there, but there still is a process, and you can still use this approach and just tailor it. So there's no template for an action map. There's just basically like the best way I like to do them is sort of draw them out manually and then sort of translate them into something more digital after that. But in the materials for this session, I've included this action map for B2B Co. If you want to use that and change the lanes and do whatever, you're more than welcome to do that. So it saves you having to do the fiddly stuff like the dash lanes and the circles and the arrows and all those different parts, which can, if you're not particularly design oriented like myself, take a lot of time. The key to a strong action map is to get into the mind of the prospective buyer and really seek to understand the things that influence them. These are small but potentially really important things that they think and decisions they make along the way. They also can, again, open up these sort of big kind of important kind of crossroad areas for you where you think, okay, this feels like it has some gravity. This feels like it's meaningful. What are we doing to make sure that X doesn't happen or Y does happen? And you'll see. So they follow, I guess, in terms of the value. I find they're as valuable as something like a driver tree in opening up the thinking around making sure there's no sort of blind spots in the approach that you've come up with. For media and messaging, you can take additional steps to inform who and how to brief. I'm going to give you just a really quick example. This isn't sort of a part of momentum. It's just an illustration that I can show you of things that you might want to do, right, really quickly. So you might want to look at critical steps to conversion. So you might want to look at the advertisement and the SERP, what those need to do, clear call to action, express benefit of action, connection to exposure on the SERP, and then you might want to look at what happens online in terms of landing, sign up commencement, sign up completion. There's some sort of key media parts. You might want to have some pillars around what media has to deliver. So it could be time, times reach, times attention as your sort of three main pillars. And you're, then got a whole bunch of things that you can use to assess suitability based on those things. You can have targeting and selection criteria. You can have, I like to have sort of and, not and ors. So age and or location plus status and or industry. So in a perfect world, you might, say for B2B Co, have all four of these. In an imperfect world, you've got one from each of the different pillars, personal and professional. You might want to look at pillar analysis and looking at different media channels by subsegment. So in this instance, we obviously have got our cohort, which is industry plus SME plus age under 55. Then you've got these different cohort subsets based on what they do in terms of what their small business industry is. And then you can look at media consumption and time spent, because that's a key part is time and attention, right? So that's just another example. I like to use scatter plots personally when looking at media. So I'll look at attention ratio as well as weekly reach and get an understanding of that. So what it can basically do is start to say, well, if I'm wanting high quality on both, I can look over here. I'm wanting high reach, low attention because I don't have a huge amount to say. I can look over here. Just a good visual way of being able to plot media on something that people can look at and understand where you're taking them. I think if you use graphs instead of tables, it's generally more for things that can be visualized. It can be much more powerful. And we touched on in the answer geographic prioritization. Here's an illustration of how you could look to do that. If you look at, like we touched on, these different tiers of SME, you can see you've got the tier, you've got the percentage of total entries, and then you've got them listed. And then you've got the media that can be targeted that way. So there are all things you could do in this translation phase to help someone understand kind of what your expectations are in terms of media delivering on the answer. You can do a whole bunch of that as well with creative. You can do a whole bunch with UX and customer experience and all those different parts. They're all going to differ depending on what problem you're solving. You might be solving a completely unrelated problem to comms. It might be a POS thing, or it might be trade marketing or something like that. So I didn't want to go into too much kind of depth around specific kind of minutiae of different channels, but that's an example, I think, of some good media practices you can take to distill something into a few slides. So we look at the master brief. That's really a summarized version of the answer. The difference is it can be much more functional, as its purpose isn't to build a case as much as it is to understand what is needed and the why behind it. And the purpose of a master brief is to not use the same brief for all capabilities involved. So you can write a master brief which kind of gives you your kind of core, this is what we need to do. And it can use the situation, complication. I put need instead of question because the question has sort of been answered. I don't need to re-prosecute the question. I can start to have needs around that, which are probably more around the answer. And then we've got a more specific kind of what we need that can give more detail under here. But what we're doing in this example is with media, creative and web is demonstrating different master briefs. And the most important thing I think is how we can communicate with them and how we can illustrate what we need in something that's going to be really easy and functional, and not create a whole ton of questions and gaps. So that's part of that. You've got your mandatories and rationale underneath. Explaining why something is being done is important. You don't want to get into a position where somebody spends a lot of time, both their time and your time, on asking questions about why a certain thing has been pursued, and then questioning whether it's the right thing or questioning whether something else should have been done. At this stage, the answer has been developed, and it's been endorsed. So it's the plane is taking off. It's not stopping and going back to the gate and reboarding an answer. So that can happen. I just think you want to do everything you can to avoid that from happening. Briefing is an activity that I think people loathe. I don't know why. I mean, it's not super exciting, and I think sometimes I don't know, people, and I can be one of those. You just sort of really phoning it in on the brief. The problem is that you're phoning it in, then someone can see you've phoned it in. And then if you phone it in, then they might also phone it in, and you've kind of then got this kind of chain of people phoning it in. It's unlikely if you phone it in and it's really sort of shit that you're going to get a great response. I think what people seeing the energy you put into something is kind of reflective of maybe the energy they've got to also put in. The other thing that can happen in briefs is the reverse. They're kind of overbaked. They have too much information. But they have a lot of information that's kind of not that interesting or not that purposeful. So there's a whole bunch of information around things that really can't impact the answer, and they can't impact the translation of it. And they can be just bogged down. They can be pages and pages long. And as a reader of the brief, and as someone who's being expected to deliver something, you're having to really kind of squeeze it pretty hard to work out what you're supposed to take out of it. So that's one part. So I think having this format again, one page, keeping it super clear and concise is probably the right way to do it. The last part is investing the time in a good brief and good steercos. So I think, a steerco doesn't have to be a 2-hour kind of tissue session or something like that. But I think what you can sort of say is, hey, 24 hours in, can you come back to us with some thinking, and we can tell you whether you're on the right track or not. That's exactly what we've done in acceleration and coherence. We've asked of the client. I think in this, fictional instance, what we saw is that it created, a better outcome. So I think if you can do that with kind of key partners, that's important. Going back to that action mapping and why we chose the 3 areas we did, they really sort of relate to the action map here. So when we looked at these kind of key areas, the message and the media is super important, because that triggers the sort of cognition, it triggers the thinking and the need, and then you start to maybe think about potential options. So nothing really happens unless you've got that first media and message sorted. So that's why creative is super key, and that's why media is super key. If you think about web and point of sale, which is web, again, we see that if search and the website are kind of not completely aligned, they can undermine some of the value that's created there. So usage is also important. That's part of the web, and obviously that's super critical. But if you think about these sort of downstream activities, you get these 3 areas right, the volume it creates has a really good chance of delivering on the answer that you need. So looking at functional briefing, and you can see here, we've got our 3 stations, not just one. Functional briefing is all about translating the answer in a way that allows the recipient to help you deliver on that. Like I said before, the 3 areas we identified in media, creative, and web. Media will always require multiple briefs because there's different channels and there's different requirements. In the materials that you hopefully have seen, or if you don't, you can request access to them. There are multiple briefs. There's 3 different media briefs that have been written. One was for a video platform, which may as well be YouTube. One was for out of home, and I can't remember what the third one was for, but it was for something. So what that allowed us to do was say, okay, the briefing for how you brief YouTube in this instance versus how you brief, say, small format out of home are going to be completely different because the way we're using them in the answer is different. So what we have to communicate is going to have to be tailored to that. Creative briefing is a little bit different to media briefing because most times the creative team has been absolutely fundamental to this process and has input into it. So they understand the reasons behind everything. they've been part of the decision making, they've been part of the steer codes, they've been part of everything. So it's really about probably giving them a little bit more pointy mandatories, because often them in their business, this will probably go around their office as well. So there may be people involved in delivering on the answer that weren't maybe in the sessions that the answer was endorsed and completed, if that makes any sense. Now, web briefing is not something you'd always do, but in the instance of a B2B co, where everything happens on the website in terms of making and forming attitudes, deeper attitudes around the suitability of B2B co for a SME, purchase, the transaction process, payment, etc., they all happen there. So as we identified in that action map, there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be done to make sure that has the best chance of success. So in this instance, what you'd say is, look, you want to get as close to them as you possibly can. You want to give them as much guidance as you possibly can. They can also give us really good guidance because they've got a bunch of information that we don't. So the idea really, in short, is you want to get as close to people that can help enable you to deliver that answer as well as possible, and treat them obviously as part of that core group. Now, I know it sounds super simplistic, but in a lot of instances that doesn't happen. A lot of instances the view will be, that's not really part of what we've been asked to do. But what I'd say is, well, absolutely, like, it's not media buying, no, but it is absolutely central to the answer. And if you're holding yourself to account on the answer and you don't do this, it's a really good chance, one, you're not going to deliver on it, and two, you're going to be carrying the can on not delivering on it. So why not spend the time and do it? Okay, so the brief in terms of media is pretty straightforward. We've outlined the situation and complication; they've remained the same. This is the what we call the distribution digital brief, which I believe is the video brief. So let's say this brief was going to either YouTube or the internal partner, trading desk, whatever you want to call it, that helps look after YouTube for B2B Co. The need here is pretty pointy. The need here is basically our requirement is to reach our target buyer consistently throughout the 12-week period. Each 4 weeks, we will rotate the primary feature in each advertisement, and we are seeking to maximize 3+ reach in this channel across a 30-day, 3 times during the campaign. And then here we've got a what we need, which is what we need in terms of the response is monthly reach and frequency universe for the audience outlined using a 6-second ad unit, directional reach and frequency curve and CPM at level of diminishing return, so we can understand where things start to become economically inefficient. Confirmation that reach can be delivered primarily in the first 2 weeks of the campaign, with the remaining 2 weeks of each of the bursts focused on frequency. This is getting pretty inside baseball for media. What this basically means is deliver most of your audience in the first 2 weeks, and then deliver sort of frequency, more exposures per audience in the next 2 weeks. Where this comes from is back, you remember in the brief, there was a view this has got to work, relatively quickly. And I think what you don't want is a really sort of slow burn. So you're looking for a bit of a fast burn in terms of reach, and then you're kind of petering out and kind of padding it with frequency. And then also the last request has been, can you give us pricing and reach differences if we use a 15 over a 6? This might be if someone says, hey, we understand that we've got to use a 6, but we love to use a 15. Can you give us like a difference in pricing or a difference in audience? So this is a really good way of saying, okay, if you used a 15, not a 6, it's going to cost XYZ more, and it's going to do this, right? Here as well, in terms of mandatories, I've split it into 3 areas. I've split audience. I've looked at the demo, plus the LGAs, plus device, plus time. Feels like a lot, but it's, I think it's right. Looked at interest and behaviors where relevant. So for video platform, these are things you can target on. So why not look at those in addition to these? That's a plus. And then I think this is really important. What we've said here is, hey, what we want someone to do is these things. We want them to click and visit B2B Co-offer, We want them to either, ideally, if they don't do that, they search B2B Co in the next 7 days. And then third thing is, if they don't do any of those things, we hope that they link the problem and the solution and our brand. The reason why I've kind of included these outcomes is that the team who are working specifically on this area might say, oh, you haven't actually thought of blah. We think blah would be really great in relation to the outcomes that you want and in relation to the brief that you've given us. So I think that allows us to sort of open up thinking where required. I think if someone says, we've got this great, idea, it doesn't deliver on any of those things and it's for a completely different audience, you'd probably say, no, it's not right. But I think this is a good way to brief. There's some key information around run dates. You can look at response required. You can look at steerco, and you put a steerco in for 12 months. Obviously, you put budgets and things in. I haven't put that in, but you would clearly put those in. But that's a kind of no-brainer. Then there's a contact with 2 elements, a mobile and an email. Sometimes I've been guilty of this. Sometimes you just put an email in and it can just be a punish for someone who really wants to speak to you quickly to ask a question. So just chuck them both in, right? Creative brief's a little bit different. You've got, again, situation and complication remain consistent. I've recapped the answer here. Creative are aware of the answer, but I think it's actually kind of just important to recap it. And then we start getting into probably what is much more critical. So what we need to achieve. So with media being much more prescriptive, I've made a decision. I want to do these things in these environments with this audience and this format. So it's much more prescriptive. It's much more of a response that's based on that requirement. For creative, sort of what you're saying is, look, the creative partner is going to have a whole bunch of different thinking. So the best thing I can do to help that thinking is just give them the kind of core fundamentals of what we're on the hook for, and then allow them to go and do their best work. Now, what we need to achieve here is demonstration of B2B Co proposition as it relates to the 3 core needs. We want that visitation to the website to learn more about the product. We want the linkage of the brand in relation to these core user needs and demand occasions. And we want commercial messaging that can feature these sort of singular feature-based messages, but can extend over the campaign to sort of feature 3 different features. I'm using the word feature a lot, but what that means is you might look at payments, invoicing, expenses, or might look at sort of payments, expenses, business dashboard. There's a bunch of things that you can do on that. But I think in that sense, what you're saying is kind of build something that can be modular enough that features can insert and can still feel like one brand, because it's likely we're going to need to make sure that we're kind of moving the needle on those 3 core features. Then there's been a kind of the core fundamentals of what's probably going to be in the distribution, the media. We've got our 6-second AV, we've got our 15-second, we've got our large format out of home, you've got social, you've got audio. Now, what I've done there is sort of say where they'll be served, what the aim of the activity is, and then maybe like why or where it's been chosen. So for 6 seconds, we've basically said, budget constraints in this sort of fictional B2B Co mean the 6-second will be the dominant format. And some of them may run adjacent to small business specific content. The out of home will be running throughout a campaign. I'll use that as another example here. They'll likely have exposure between 8 and 10 seconds total. They'll be running alongside busy highways. Most people seeing these will either be driving or being a passenger. So it's vital the brand is easily identifiable, the copy is as concise as possible. And then for the small format, we're looking at more kind of transit-based areas where most of the views will be on foot. But again, this feels really obvious, but I think giving someone an example of how the message will be received in the real world means that you are kind of stepping away from the screen. You're not looking at a large format on a big Mac monitor, and then when you chuck it on the P and highway, you can't see the logo until you're basically under it, and by that time you're at a light and you've gone through it. So that's where I think that this sort of briefing can really help. And I think then for the creative component, you can sort of say, okay, I'm really clear on what the problem is, what the answer is, where it's going to be done, what success looks like. The chances of getting it right, I think, are really strong. For the web point of sale, again, situation complication remains consistent. The answer is a pretty concise explanation. They may have been across it, they may not have been. So I think in this instance, it's best basically to say, okay, here's just a concise thing. What do you reckon? Any questions, etc. And then the what we need to achieve, which is really not that different to the creative group in terms of the demonstration around the needs. So I think, again, this sort of web user experience product cut team could say, okay, cool, we're really clear on what your brief is, what your requirement is. And then what we're saying is, well, hey, can you help us with that? So here's some requests, here's some thinking that we'd really like to work with you on. One, with search, we really want to make sure that the offer is reaffirmed in the search copy, because we just think it's a really strong offer, and we want to make sure that we're never disconnecting from it. We want to make sure that the trial sign up is consistent across screens, and the sign-up fields are as minimal as possible, so someone doesn't drop off because we're asking them a whole bunch of information we don't need in order to transact the payment. Can we make sure that the website generally, if someone lands on the website who hasn't seen the offer, that it's easy for them to access, and ideally it's on like a ribbon or something across every screen? Can we make sure that there's a little bit of commonality between the ad messaging and the site experience, or vice versa, so it doesn't feel like a completely different company with a completely different message? So again, these things feel really obvious, but you look at any campaign, there's a ton of campaigns in market right now, really great brand campaigns, and then you go to the brand's website and it looks completely different. There is absolutely no reference to what was in the ad. Some of these are $30-40 million campaigns, and for some reason it's never made its way to the website, which I think is just a miss. And then we've got some information here around ratios, which is that our modelling for B2B Co suggests that we need X percent of visitors to convert from general interest to trial sign-up commencement. And then we need Y of those people to convert from commencement to completion. What we've asked here is, can you provide guidance on how these compare to current ratios and any other similar promotions, so we can see whether these are as accurate as we think they are. And in this instance, they could say, yep, it's about right, or actually being really conservative, or hey, it's actually really over the top, and it's not that likely to happen. Yes, you could do this in the immersion stage, and if you're completely off, you'd hope that in the endorsement stage, someone would say these, are really optimistic. But I think in this instance, what we're sort of saying is, hey, can we just get like a second absolute assurance of this? And then other one is, hey, we're going to need information on the ratios when our campaign goes live too. So you've kind of got things here around user experience, talking about the attitudinal blockers, and then also validation of some of the thinking that we've had before. So there you've sort of got your three brief examples. So you see that they're different, but I believe that you could walk away from that feeling like, okay, I've given them a relatively good amount of information. I haven't overloaded them with information, but I've told them, one, what the problem is, what the answer is, what we expect, and what some of the mandatories are. Next step would be a STICO and some guidance and seeing, how it's tracking. So I'd request a short STICO at briefing stage and say, this is coming. It's not like I'm just going to call you out of nowhere and go through it. I'm going to request a short STICO with the partners, gives them the chance to surface ideas, and then you can get a handle on where their thinking is heading. So this may not be enough time for creative, but they've probably had some thinking. And again, it's kind of like a safe space to start thinking about it. They might come back and say, hey, we're really struggling because you've given us such tight constraints and we don't know whether we can get there on it. Either way, I think it's worth having it because you will get something out of it much better than not having it and waiting, say, a week. Again, the STICO is all about momentum. This whole process is around not stopping. The idea is you're trying to sort of spin the wheel, so you're moving towards either, moving towards solving the problem. You're moving towards distilling the problem, then you're moving towards sort of finding an answer, and you're moving closer to an answer. And then when you've got an answer, you're moving closer to endorsement. And then you've got endorsement, and you move closer to how you translate that. Then you're briefing it out, and you're getting a whole bunch of different ideas. You don't want to stop. I think once you stop, there's a whole bunch of energy that needs to be created to start again. So you're trying to sort of keep the thing moving, keep the thing turning. So in this instance, these are all really important things, and you want to start getting some energy back, some thinking back on it, and allow these to be shaped and built upon or evolved or improved or whatever else. What I'd say, and this is probably more for media, is if a media partner is seeking guidance that will improve the answer, I think invest the time. If it's like, I've got an idea or I've got a property and I think it's really great, but I'm just not quite sure, that's worth the 2 minutes. I think if it's, we thought we'd get more money than we got, that's important stuff. Like, it's super important to them, but is it super relevant to the answer that you're really trying really hard to focus on? It may not be. So in that instance, you'd probably say, look, we probably need to discuss this, but now is probably not the time. Can we wait? Can we just focus on X, Y, Z? So you don't dismiss it, you acknowledge it, but you sort of focus it on that answer, because it's unlikely right now you can resolve it. But in most instances, I think what you'll find is someone says, I've got this great idea, but before I invest too much time, I want to make sure that it's right. Do the steerco, see where it goes. You might need 1 or 2 steercos per partner to ensure that there's sort of what we call adequate translation. I think with creative, there can be multiple, and some examples I've worked on. There's been a lot of back and forward. You might have 5 or 6 different discussions, and I think that's okay, because they're just sort of seeking some guidance or seeking some affirmation, or they've got some questions, or you're seeking some on the other end. So I think in that sense, you're all part of one group. I think, say, in this instance, say with web and point of sale, I don't think you're going to need, 5 steercos there. I think it's probably a yes or a no, or a yes but, whatever. And for media, in a lot of instances, it's going to be relatively transactional, and that's okay. And in some instances, there may be some new ideas, but I don't think it's going to be the sort of constant, what about this, what about this, what about this, what about this? So ideally what happens is you get to a point where you get their answer to your answer, if that makes any sense. And for where you need to make decisions, there's going to be decisions that need to be made probably on messaging and creative. And there's going to be decisions that need to be made on media and distribution. I think with that, the best way to take a lot of the subjectivities out is using a decision matrix. What a decision matrix will allow you to do is make choices on what partners or messages or placements or whatever it is, right? Where there has to be a whittling down, are critical to the answer. So you're kind of going back to the answer, you're going back to the problem, working out what you're trying to solve, and then ultimately trying to sort of make a sort of concise, logical view of how each of those could solve that in order to work out the ones that do it in the best way. So the criteria is super important. The criteria is going to change depending on what the problem is. That's absolutely critical. There's never like one universal criteria. It's not like I can look at every single message and think, does it make the brand famous, or is it high reach, or is it lowest cost? And they are universally always going to be the thing that you need to preference. That's probably not the case. They're always going to differ, and I think for B2B Co, there are specific areas, and we'll run through them. It also avoids default positions that may not serve the answer, or default positions that are subjective, that don't have a whole lot of robust data behind them. This is more premium than that because I like that and I don't like this thing, or things that really have nothing to do with the audience and more has to do with the people making the decisions and their own views. Sometimes those views are fine, but I think you still want to run them through this, and this allows everything to be considered, and it can be looked at. So you might say, okay, well, for an example of premium, yep, that could be right, but that's not something that has been considered super important for what we're trying to solve for here. So we really can't think about it too much. So it allows you to sort of cleanly move that away and look at something that's in relation to B2B Co. Here, in terms of decision factors, we've looked at engagement, reach, and impact, which is again the sort of time, reach, attention, right? It is basically what we've done here. And then what we've put is engagement, time on channel, and frequency of usage consumption, super key. This is media, by the way. Reach, available reach of target cohort at budget level in LGA specified on the 2-week reach. So making sure that 2 weeks. So it's not over the 4-week context, it's over the 2-week context. And then impact is the ability of the channel to provide adequate explanation of feature. So we know we're going to have one feature, and then we want to have linkage to the brand. So there's going to be probably a level of time required, a level of size required, a level of viewability required, right? So that's going to feed into this score. Now, we've got our options here, and then we've got scoring. So we've got weighting here, which everything's weighted equally at a 10, which means all the weightings cancel each other out. And then we've got our different channels, and we've got kind of how they perform on each. Now, these are just numbers I've populated to illustrate it. This is not what I believe, because this is not a real campaign, right? But what you can see here is when I look at the total, there's some that are kind of right there in terms of probably these ones, sorry. And then there's a few that miss out, these channel 1, 2, 3s. And then we can see kind of where they missed out. So we can say, it's okay, channel 1, you're great on reach, but the engagement wasn't enough and we didn't think the impact was there. So it kind of hurt the score. Channel 2, your engagement was pretty good, but you just don't reach enough people. And in this instance, we felt we could get it somewhere else, right? So that's kind of the way that you're gonna run through that decision matrix. I really urge you to use these. Because I think they can help. This isn't a huge time burn. You just need to sort of go, okay, I've got a bunch of things I need to make. I've got a record of how I made the decision. I can do this within a group. We can agree on scoring. And what it also might do is unlock some things that maybe, don't present in the initial presentation. So I'll give you an illustration of this from my media experience. Is some people... will love really well-designed proposals. And so they'll say, well, the design's awesome. It looks great, looks really awesome. And then ugly ones, they'll go, oh, well, it looks like they haven't spent much time. And it looks a bit shit and da-da-da-da, right? Which is sometimes a really good leading indicator. But ultimately, the packaging is sort of the box. You got to open the box and see what the substance is. So it stops you making decisions based on aesthetics or based on other things that again aren't related. And what you might find is, oh, okay, I didn't think that X proposal was that strong, but I actually ran it through the things that are so important on this campaign. It's like super strong, and we think it's going to be something that we can do. So I think then it probably again can improve decision making. And can make sure that you can think a little bit differently to how others are thinking because you're a little bit tighter in that. I touched on earlier the pre-mortem. I'm going to run through why it's important, despite the fact that it sounds very dark and very grim. You're ultimately visualizing failure in order to succeed. So there's two ways you can look at this sort of thing. You can look at what would happen if this was super awesome and amazing and great. So there was an old technique used by a creative agency where they would write the press release, and they would say the press release or the award entry is going to say these things, so we need to kind of make sure we can say those things, and therefore that helps shape what we need to visualize in terms of the future. That can be positive, but I think it can also sort of focus on stuff that could be really great. I think a lot of the time, what you're trying to prevent, it's not that you're trying to prevent greatness from happening, but the things that can undo you can be really kind of monotonous sort of, standard stuff. So the pre-mortem, I think, can give you a handle of, okay, like here's all these things that can kind of trip us up. And so my view is if you wrote a award entry about how something could be really amazing, it's unlikely the award entry would be like there were no errors, reporting was really strong, this happened, that happened, that happened. It would be probably bigger fundamental things that I think we've covered in the answer. We sold this many things, it delivered blah, blah, return. So I think we've covered on what does greatness look like. Greatness looks like delivering on the answer. What does success look like in terms of avoiding failure? Well, that's where the pre-mortem comes in. So decisions have been made. So we've gone through with our partners, okay, we need X, Y, Z. We've made some decisions on what's going to be included. We've got our decision matrix. So now we're kind of getting close to translating that answer into something that makes sense in terms of a map of where we head once we start to execute. I think it's important, again, in this instance, to look at all potential circumstances that can get in the way of achieving the answer. Unforeseen circumstances is a word that you hear used more and more. I think in most instances when someone says, oh, they were unforeseen circumstances, a lot of the time you'll be like, how could those be unforeseen? Like, you could have seen that coming a mile off. It's kind of like a weaselly disclaimer, which is like, oh, I couldn't possibly have seen that happening. And maybe they didn't, but in some instances you could say, well, you probably needed to try a bit harder to see that probably could have happened. And again, in this instance, you're being relied on as an expert. You're being relied on as someone who can see things others can't see. So you can't really use that as an excuse and also say, oh, I'll take credit for all the positive things, but all the things that were negative, I couldn't possibly have seen those occurring. It's not that credible. Marketing implications of failure are significant. They're significant in terms of financial repercussions. They're significant in terms of commercial repercussions for the client and yourself. There's reputational, commercial challenges as well. So it's not to scare anybody, but it's sort of to say, look, this is the privilege of the position we're in is that if we kind of mess it up, people will see. So it's consequential. It's not consequential in terms of like moving the share price, but it's consequential for a business. And I think you want, again, to be taken seriously by that business. You want to be seen as taking that seriously. So a pre-mortem is a really good way of evaluating what could go wrong. What you do is you air that. So you don't sort of push it down, you air it out. Because it's fictional, it's hypothetical, right? So it's not threatening. You're not pointing the finger at anybody. You're sort of saying, hey, here's all these things that could go wrong. Let's kind of identify them, and then let's work out how we don't have to deal with them, how they don't occur. So you're raising awareness of it, you're understanding the drivers of how it could happen, and you're building systems to avoid it. And that's the fundamental part, is you don't just do this and go, oh, well, here's a whole bunch of things that could go wrong. At least now we know. what you say is, all right, I need to build some systems, some management systems in this translation phase that make sure that these have the lowest chance of occurring. And then if they do occur, I can sit there and say, well, hey, we saw that happening. We did boom, 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 boom. But, it maybe still happened. So pre-mortem, there's a whole bunch of steps. We'll go through them here. The templates are in the materials. So you're looking at your project outline here. And then in this first step here, you can just get together as a group internally and just write every single thing that could go wrong. Don't self-censor, just write it all down. You've got your failure date, which is sort of when failure would be evident. And then you've got, what does it look like? So what does like a failure point look like? So you can start wherever you want to start. You could sort of start here and say, okay, everyone will know that we have failed a month after the campaign. Or they might know we've failed 4 weeks into the campaign. What does it look like? What happens? And then outline as a group everything that could go wrong and why it would go wrong. So for B2B Co, here, we've got our project outline, but then we've got a failure date of October 2024. And then failure is basically missing the net customer target by more than 15%. So I've made that up, but let's assume someone at B2B Co has said, hey, if we miss it, if we flub by over 15, it's going to look bad. So you've got a line. So you get to 90%, okay, well, we might be okay there. But you get under 50, you get to 85 or under, someone's going to be asking questions. Now it's not catastrophic, but in this instance, it's like, okay, that campaign's not going to be deemed successful. It's going to be deemed, and contrary to every post analysis ever done in every single marketing activity, some marketing campaigns fail, some media campaigns fail as well. I think we're often loath to attach ourselves to that failure, but not everything can work all the time. And sometimes the expectation of a result in terms of where they're setting the bar is just not realistic, and you only know when you put it out into the field. So we look here and go, okay, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? So we've got this, first 2 to 3 weeks fail to connect with audiences, so our metrics don't change. We're sending traffic to the wrong page on the website, so we burn a whole bunch of money and nothing happens. There's broken links, which means that, users aren't, going to where we want them to go to. They just go to nothing. Our media delivers way too early in the campaign. In the first 4 weeks, we burn all the cash, and then we've got 12 weeks with hardly anything to spend money on. Landing page isn't converting. Our reach curves are inaccurate. Blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of different things that end up being there. And this isn't exhaustive by any means. And this isn't sort of doomsayer either. I think this is just a bunch of things that could go wrong. These are all illustrations of things that I've seen go wrong in various campaigns. Frequently, right? So they're not like, oh, well, that's a real unlikely thing. These are things that go wrong. What generally happens is you see it going wrong and you scramble to try and fix it and try and make good on it. But in most instances, I can say that when these things have been identified, there's sort of probably been no acknowledgement up front that they were likely to happen. It's just sort of like, oh, this thing happened. Yeah, we didn't think it would happen, but like it did. And you're like, that's, it was probably pretty likely to occur. What you'll then do is kind of pull all of these different potential things that could go wrong, and you're going to map them. And you're going to map them on 2 axes. You're going to map them on the potential for them to occur. So is it realistic that this is going to happen? You got high and you got low. And then you got impact. What would happen if this thing happened? Is it like catastrophic? Is it really, damaging? Or is it kind of light? So in this instance, you can change these if you want, but I think these are about right. Because what you're trying to say is, all right, I may not be able to build systems for every single thing. I might only be able to build systems for the key stuff. And I might have to roll the dice on some things if they have like low impact and they're low potential. I might take my chances. But if something's like really high impact, moderate potential, or high potential, it would be negligent of me not to make sure I'm doing every single thing to stop that from happening. So you've got to be really practical. So in this instance, I've put them all in different areas. There's a high impact and potential. And then on the next slide, I've themed them. So I've sort of said, okay, if I just have them unthemed, it's really difficult for me to probably build systems that can fix them. I also need to look at the ones in red that are kind of red hot danger and the other ones that may not be red hot danger. So I've identified here a whole bunch of things that I think are red hot. And I've got to make sure that I'm going to build some systems in this translation phase to work at those so they don't happen. So you can see here. So what you've got here is you've got, like I touched on before, you've got your map with your potential and your impacts, and then you've got your theming, and then you've got your colouring on the theming. So my kind of pillars here are logistics and setup, so how I set the campaign up, what can happen in the delivery of the campaign, just the normal kind of delivery of pacing and all those different things. I look at how we're measuring it. You can look at performance, i.e. like what it's actually doing. And then the fifth one is the communication, is how I'm communicating the campaign in conjunction with the client to the executive team at the client. And that's, again, super critical, identified right up front in the brief, which was the CEO is going to be active and the peer group, the executive peer group, are going to need validation this is strong in the first 4 to 6 weeks. So communication for me is, okay, if I do all these things and don't communicate it well, internally there's going to be low confidence. I've got to make sure I build a system for that. Then you're looking at this management system build. So the pre-mortem turns the observation into action and accountability, which means that, okay, I feel empowered because, yep, all these things could happen, but I can build systems. I've got time to make sure that they don't occur. And if they do, I've got sort of contingencies in place, which mean that I can identify them really quickly and take action before they become damaging. In that prior step, the value points have been themed and categorized, so you can focus on that future value of what's high impact. Again, unlikely you're going to have infinite resource. You can't do everything. You've got to do the most important things. In the next step, which is the building of the systems, outline the tasks and the jobs that alleviate the failure point, alleviate the issue to the best of your ability, and then be really thorough and clear around what's required, when, and the person required. So make it something that becomes manageable and that everyone who walks away is clear, one, on why this is important, and that's why this needs to be done in a group, and also when it's required. So here's your format here. You've got your theme. We touched on, we had our 5 themes. Then you're going to have the individual actions that help manage against those themes. You've got responsibility and you've got due date, or when it needs to occur. So it's pretty good in terms of making sure, all right, we know who's on the hook. We know when it needs to be done, so we can be confident around timings. We know exactly what needs to be done, and then we know what theme it's addressing. So here's just an example. We've got our logistics. So I've got a bunch of stuff I've written here around review landing pages by a certain date, check imagery copy to ensure the alignment, speak to ex-media partner to confirm SLAs on rotating new creative because that was a potential issue. We've got our delivery ones, we've got our measurement ones, we've got our planning and oversight ones, and we've got our communication ones as well. So these all have due dates. They would all have people responsible as well. And what this, it doesn't create a ton more work, but it creates a bunch of things that, again, make sure that this answer has every chance of delivering when it gets to execution. So what I'd say here is this is right in the pointy kind of management oversight end of an answer, but this effectively allows the answer to deliver on being the answer. And the strategic answer is all about this. This is strategic decision-making around what is super critical to deliver on the commercial outcome the client needs. You miss these things, you're probably not going to deliver on that, which means even if your answer was great, even if it looked really great on PowerPoint, even if you told a really good story, the credibility's out the window as soon as it's not delivering. So translation, all about keeping momentum, all about keeping the wheel spinning. Ideally, you can do all of this in a week. Not that you're going to get final, creative messaging or anything like that, but you should be able to get media returns in a week. You should be able to do a pre-mortem in a week, the action map, all those different parts. So think about how you do this in a fast way that means that it has a sense of momentum behind it. It's not something that's being done in little piecemeal parts. What that means when you sort of zoom back out is that since getting the brief, in 2 weeks, we've basically cracked the problem, cracked the answer, got the endorsement, delivered it to partners, got them clear across it, selected what becomes, the key ingredients of the answer, and then worked out all the management systems required that mean that it can be delivered upon to the best of our ability. That's, I think, is where things are heading in terms of the speed of which clients are going to require responses. And I think that the change that it requires for us is much more sort of deeper work and deeper focus to allow us to get something out the door of the high quality in a fast amount of time with this level of depth. I touched on in the last 2 sessions, and I'll go through it again, urgency and speed, super important in terms of competing in a category, super important in terms of moving at the speed of customers. Nobody else can wait till you solve the problem. The problem is pressing, it's there, it's uncomfortable, you got to move on it. I think this idea of, it's going to take us 6 weeks to respond, and then we've got to book 18 weeks in advance. It can be a completely different environment in 24 weeks. In this instance, a lot can change in 2 weeks, but it's unlikely the world's going to completely change in that time. So what it means is when that problem has been identified and has been given to you, 2 weeks later, you've got a pretty defined way of solving for it, which I think is ideal. I think it's a high value, and I think it's something we can really hang our hat on. This level of speed requires like a fungible team. I think you can never deliver at pace when you're having to move something around all the time. So, I can't do that because I'm not the blah expert, or I couldn't possibly do that because I'm not strategic. I couldn't possibly do that because I'm not X. I think you're looking for breadth of capability here, and to deliver something in, say, 2-3 days, like immersion, like the answer, you need to be able to think really broadly across what things mean, and you need to challenge your own kind of perspectives of what the job is or what the role is, in order to sort of say, okay, like I might be a media planner, but I'm going to have to start thinking a little bit differently, or apply a lot of these skills that I've applied to media and look at them in a bit of a more commercial way. But I think the fungibility allows this to occur. And I think it's really difficult to do it without fungibility. So I'd say, one of the greatest skills you can have is to be fungible, and be able to solve a whole bunch of different problems using different capabilities. And I would encourage everybody to continue to try and build that muscle. The connected, coherent problem solving is the other kind of critical part, which is when you're solving something, you're really thinking about the systems required, the implications downstream, what implications it has on the consumer, how it interrelates with a whole bunch of different areas. You've got to be able to sort of think that you're probably like you're either a hub with different spokes, or you're part of a different network, and all those different things can help either deliver on and help nudge you closer to success. And if they're left and they're left alone, they can make it really hard to achieve that. But it's very rare that in any kind of marketing role you're existing in a silo where only the environment that is around you is something that impacts your role or the task that you've got to do. So I think that connection, coherent, being able to view the environment that can impact success or failure in a really kind of nuanced, purposeful, thoughtful way, super important. So that connected, coherent problem solving, super key. So the recap in translation, we touched on the master translation brief. So translating the answer from the focus of endorsement to a focus of delivery, right? 2 different audiences, 2 different needs, 1 answer. There's a little bit of, art to being able to translate in that sense. With a functional brief, you're identifying those key areas. We touched on media, creative, and web because we knew they were important. We looked at the action map. We had a bunch of data to make sure that was quantified. Anything that's got significant power or impact over the customer is worth a functional brief too. Sticos, in terms of guidance and collaboratively shaping the idea, they keep momentum, they keep energy, they keep that sort of shared goal in place. The decision weighting for selection, really important. Can make sure that you don't miss something, can make sure that your thinking is super sharp in relation to what is absolutely important. You don't get any defaults, you don't get any subjectivities, and you can stay really true to the answer, which is, we touched on right in the first session, right in session 0, that is a key kind of cultural pillar of momentum is staying true to the answer and serving the answer and serving the problem. The pre-mortem, valuable reframe of what success requires. And I think we showed there how you can identify a whole bunch of failure points and then put something in place that gives you real confidence in terms of your ability to deliver on those things and make sure that they have the lowest chance of occurring, and sort of turning that potential negative into a positive, into something that gives you confidence. And then that management system build. So the building systems that can foresee failure points is just good business, right? It will save you tons of time because nothing ever delivers completely as you want it. And I think it generates credibility in the instance that it's needed. So it's not like you would have a client presentation and say, here's all the things I'm doing to make sure that this doesn't fail. I think you will ideally get credit for it if those things were to occur. But they're really those fail safes that are there just in case. And I think never be too kind of cocky or complacent that you don't need those, because at some point you will. And you want to make sure that when they are needed, you're not the one who's neglected to do it. So that's a really good way of completing that sort of translation process. So that's it for session 2. Hopefully that's given you a good idea of what we've meant by translation. Hopefully the materials give you a really great idea of how you can apply this yourself. We'll see you next session for distribution. Thank you. Bye.